ambitious and far-reaching prison reform program ever undertaken in the history of the world. The Gulag system embodied a view of imprisonment that was as far as could be from the vision of the international human rights framework. The International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights tells us that all those deprived of their liberty shall be treated with humanity and respect for the inherent dignity of the human person. The Gulag philosophy was quite different. In that philosophy, prisoners were enemies of the state. They were shipped thousands of miles from their homes and made to work. After the fall of the Soviet Union, the changes were huge. All of those countries, in theory, and some in actual practice, made a transition from the view that prisoners are enemies to the democratic view that prisoners are citizens. The person in the Russian government who opened up Butyrka prison for us was one of those, for whom exposure to the human rights framework was a true revelation. And he changed the Russian system, a system where detainees were shot, shackled, locked in dark rooms, and left to die from TB. He and others like him heard and saw what the international community says about the treatment of anyone who's been locked up by the state. They understood the transformation that was needed. And treating their fellow human beings as fellow citizens and helping them to rehabilitation took them into a different ethical universe, which was one that they preferred to be in. And as I was involved, as was Andrew, in that process for over a decade, it became very clear to me what huge good fortune it was that we have the International Human Rights Framework, which tells everyone in the world how detained people must be treated. And it tells us that those accused are innocent until proven guilty, as the New Zealand Human Rights Commission has indicated to the New Zealand government recently regarding its proposal to reverse the presumption of innocence when granting bail. The International Human Rights Framework gives us a world template that requires imprisonment to be judged first and foremost by its adherence to ethical standards. Few come up to those high expectations, but many try. The visit to Butyrka prison was historic because it was the beginning of the acceptance by the whole world, and not just half of it, that apart from a few rogue countries, prisons should be run according to human rights principles. This human rights framework matters to people. It works as an idea and as a view of a better world. It inspires groups of activists everywhere, and I imagine it's what inspires many of you here tonight who work in prisons, with prisons, to help ex-prisoners and to get better public policies on prisons. It's a hugely important contribution to a more ethical world, and we should treasure it. And the fact that we have it has been an engine of prison reform all around the world and should make one feel optimistic of where we can go. So that's my first major reflection on the last 3 decades. The spreading across the world of an ethical approach to locking people up is a tremendous step forward for humanity all around the world. There are people like you here tonight who want prisons to be humane, rights-respecting places everywhere. In Japan, in China, in South Africa, in Egypt, in Brazil. I could tell you the names of many of them. Almost everywhere, it's a huge community, and everyone here tonight is, I'm sure, a part of it. But, there's a big but. What might that be? Here's another bit of history. In 2003, I was at a meeting at a university in a small town in the United States called White Plains in New York State. It was also a remarkable gathering. All the gurus and activists and stars of the American prison reform movement were there. The person who got the whole prison system in the state of Alabama taken to court and decided by the court that it was unconstitutional, he was there. The person who got the state penitentiary in Vermont closed because it was cruel and inhumane. Many more. But they were not there to celebrate what they'd achieved. They were there to ask themselves, how could they have got it so wrong? Whilst they were beavering away to get their cases through the courts and improve a few things for a few people, the number of those locked up in the United States had risen from 500,000 in 1980 to 2.025 million in 2002. That's an increase times 4. And was that in itself, so they asked, not a huge human rights abuse? And what had they done about that, they asked? Hardly anything, they admitted. They'd got it wrong. And it was not just 1.5 million more prisoners. Who were these prisoners? When you walk into the prisons of the world, whom do you see? Do you see a cross-section of society? Do you meet the rich and the poor, the literate and the illiterate, the sick and the healthy, in roughly proportionate numbers? The answer is not in doubt. You certainly do not. Whether you're in the north or the south, the developed or the poor world, wherever you are, you will see mainly people from the bottom of society. You'll see mostly men, some women, about 1 in 20 prisoners on average is a woman. The women you see will have come from particularly disadvantaged backgrounds of violence and abuse, women who've been victims most of their lives. You will certainly sometimes see an ex-police officer. You will sometimes see a lawyer. I've seen a politician, I don't think I've ever seen a banker in prison. And if this weren't going on YouTube, I'd say that can be seen as a pity in some ways. Prisons are full of the poor and the marginalised. And also, there's something else very striking about the people in prison. If in the population of a particular country there's a minority, black people say, or Hispanic people say, you'll see a lot more of them in the prisons than in the streets outside. In the United States, 708 out of every 100,000 white men are in a state or a federal prison. That's enough to make one feel shocked. However, 4,749 out of every 100,000 black men are in state or federal prison, 6 times more. Australia is even more shocking. In Australia, there are 1,892 Aboriginal prisoners for every 100,000, whereas for non-Indigenous prisoners, it's 134. So that's 14 times more. I was in Australia earlier this year. I read in the newspaper of Western Australia this little story. They're having to make budget cuts in the prison service.